Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about chapter 12, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. If you don't remember anything about demand and supply, please review chapter 3. In chapter 3, we define demand and supply in one particular market, perfect competition market. Then we put demand and supply together to define market equilibrium. In this chapter, we're going to pretty much do the same thing, but it's different because we're going to talk about the total demand and total supply for the entire economy. When we're done with that, we're going to put the aggregate demand and aggregate supply together to define macroeconomic equilibrium. You need to know, if you look at the notes, you need to know how we're defining aggregate demand, which is very similar to how we define demand in chapter 3. So aggregate demand, again, shows the relationship between price and output that people purchase. But since we're talking about the total demand for the economy, we're talking about goods and services that all the buyers in the economy are going to buy. So the components of this output is very similar to what we had in chapter 7 for GDP. So again, we have consumption expenditures, we have investment, we have government spending, we have net export. These are all our output, our total output, our quantity of real GDP demanded, as we call it. We call this quantity, this output in chapter 3, quantity demanded. But here, since we're talking about the output for the entire economy, we're going to call it differently. We're going to call it quantity of real GDP demanded. And also, just like chapter 3, remember, if the price changes, our aggregate demand, same thing for aggregate supply, will not shift at all. But if consumption expenditure, investment, net export, government spending changes, then we'll have a shift in our aggregate demand. Again, if aggregate demand increases, we have a rightward shift. If aggregate demand decreases, we have a leftward shift, just like chapter 3. Same thing for aggregate supply. Our aggregate demand is very similar to demand in chapter 3. It is downward slope because we have an inverse relationship between price and this total amount of output for the entire economy that we called it quantity of real GDP demanded. So it is again downward slope, showing this negative relationship between price and output, price and quantity. Look into the factors that can shift aggregate demand. Again, these are all the components we had for GDP in chapter 7. C, I, G, and net export can shift our aggregate demand. So easy to remember that the quantity of real GDP demanded are the factors in real GDP, and also the factors that can shift our aggregate demand are the components in GDP again. Okay, so kind of easy to remember. Okay, so if, for instance, consumption expenditure increases, people spend more money in the economy, aggregate demand will increase. If investment in the economy decreases, the aggregate demand will decrease. We have a leftward shift. If government starts spending more, like right now because of COVID-19, since we're entering the recession, so the government is trying to spend more money. That's why some people are going to get those paychecks pretty soon. So these are government spending. So if the government spending increases, aggregate demand will shift to the right. Okay, so all the components we had for GDP in chapter 7 are also the factors that can shift our aggregate demand, our total demand. Aggregate supply, you need to know that the aggregate supply is very similar to the supply again we had in chapter 3. Aggregate demand is coming from the supply side of the whole economy. So we're talking about total supply here. It shows the relationship again between the price and the total output coming from the supply side of the market. We called it quantity supplied in chapter 3, the amount of goods and services that are supplied by all the suppliers in perfect competition market. Pretty much same thing here. Aggregate supply shows the relationship between price and the quantity of real GDP supplied, which is again the amount of goods and services supplied by the entire suppliers in the market and it can change if basically the resources that we have in the economy, like the amount of workers, the amount of natural resources, those factors of production changes, the quantity supplied will change here. Okay, technology, productivity, human capital, these are all the factors that can change our quantity supply, quantity of real GDP supply. Again, if price changes, there is no shift in our aggregate supply. We have a typical shape for aggregate supply, again upward slope, very very similar to chapter 3. So our aggregate supply is again upward slope. If price changes, just like aggregate demand, there is no shift. But if the price of resources changes, especially oil, so we talk a lot about oil here in this chapter, if price of our resources just like chapter 3 changes, there will be a shift in aggregate supply. For instance, if oil becomes cheaper, like right now, aggregate supply will increase, but of course it's a little bit different right now because of COVID-19, because we're kind of entering the recession. So however, the price of oil is lower than before, but because of the other reasons, other things that are happening in the economy, it is unlikely to see an increase in aggregate supply. But in the normal economy, if the price of, and healthy economy, if the price of input, especially oil, decreases, you should see an increase in aggregate supply, okay, and rightward shift in aggregate supply, and vice versa. Another important thing that can change aggregate supply is productivity of labor, productivity of any factor of production, capital, labor, anything. But our focus in this chapter is on price of oil as a factor that can shift our aggregate supply. So if price changes, there's no shift in aggregate supply or aggregate demand. Aggregate demand shifts if consumption expenditure, investment, government spending, and net export changes. Aggregate supply shifts if the price of input changes or our productivity of resources. Okay, so good thing to remember. If you put the aggregate demand and aggregate supply together, then you can define your macroeconomic equilibrium, just like chapter 3. So the intersection of our downward slope aggregate demand, our upward slope aggregate supply will be our will be our macroeconomic equilibrium. So again, just like chapter 3, at the macroeconomic equilibrium, we will have one price, that will be our equilibrium price, and then we have one output. Since we're talking about the entire economy, that will be our equilibrium real GDP. Okay, I will talk about shift at the equilibrium in another video for you, but so far everything that I explained is pretty much similar to chapter 3, how we define demand and supply, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, how we define macroeconomic equilibrium, very very similar to chapter 3. So I definitely encourage you guys to review chapter 3, because the concept is pretty similar, but the factors that can shift our aggregate demand, aggregate supply are definitely different, because we're talking about the entire economy. Okay, so I will explain about the changes in the equilibrium in the second video for you. Okay, bye for now.